Well, hello and welcome to Hudson Institute here in DC. I'm Jeremy Hunt. I'm a media fellow here, and we are a research organization focused on promoting American leadership for a secure, free, and prosperous future. And we have with us today Rich Goldberg, we're just so honored that he's joining us. We're going to be talking about discussing the Biden administration's plan to build a pier off the coast of Gaza for humanitarian purposes, is the purported reason. As many of you know, President Biden unveiled this project at the State of the Union address some weeks ago. And since then, some additional details have come out. But we want to kind of talk about many of the concerns that several folks have just about troop safety, sending American military service members overseas to the coast of Gaza to build this pier, and just generally the signal that it sends to the Middle East. Right in the middle of this Israel-Hamas war that's going on. And so, as I mentioned, we have Rich Goldberg here to chat with us. And he's a senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He served in a variety of government posts, former top aide in the House and Senate, a member of the National Security Council staff, and he's also a Navy Reserve intelligence officer. And we'll forgive him for the Navy part of this as an Army guy, but that's okay. And on Capitol Hill,
Oh,
on Capitol Hill, he worked extensively on foreign assistance oversight, including U.S. aid to the West Bank and Gaza, and the delivery of aid to conflict zones. So he brings a really kind of a keen understanding of a lot of the situation we face today, just a lot of these issues in Gaza, and the president's proposal to deliver humanitarian assistance by sea. So again, thank you so
of
much, Rich,
course.
for being with us.
Go Navy beat Army, I think is the only way to respond to that
Oh,
introduction, but we can keep going. It's fine. It's all good.
I'll let that fly for now, Rich. But I wanted to just kind of start kind of at a bird's eye view. Well, what is the kind of the purpose behind this pier? Where did this idea develop? And can you kind of just give us some background as we get
Yeah,
started?
I mean, two actual interesting data points. Number one, for many years, there had been this economic development plan that was pushed around by now the former foreign minister of Israel. There was a PowerPoint that went with it. A lot of people were shown it in the Middle East, Western capitals, investors, etc. And the idea was is that there could be some future that Gaza could have with economic development if you incorporated their access to the sea. Now, if you could actually demilitarize Gaza, de-radicalize Gaza, get rid of Hamas one day, look at the potential. You have Gaza sitting right there on the Mediterranean. You could build some sort of a port or pier extension, have trade, not just aid coming in, but things going out to really give some sort of a future to Gaza. So the idea of a port pier in Gaza in the long term, in the future, without Hamas, had already been discussed in the backdrop of various Middle East peace plans. Secondarily, right after October 7th, as the war was kicking off, we've seen reports that, in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu put forward the idea uh, of a sea-based delivery of aid that would be somehow controlled, secure, under a non-Hamas distribution network. And that was ignored or sort of put on ice until it was suddenly back on the front burner from this administration. More recently, I think, certainly behind closed doors, as people have been discussing the day after the war, once Hamas had fallen, and you could ensure secure distribution networks for aid coming in, there was the idea of having, again, some sort of a port or pier, both to receive aid and other sort of humanitarian supplies that or economic supplies that might be connected to reconstruction, and also that long-term economic development future path for Gaza. But the idea of having something that is not secured, not guaranteed in its distribution path, while Hamas remains in some level of power control in Gaza, was certainly not one that was contemplated. And so, what led to this? Well, we had seen a couple of weeks of increased political pressure on the president by his base. Certainly in the lead up to the Michigan primary, we had seen him starting to lean into this narrative, which is largely pushed by Hamas and its disinformation networks like Al Jazeera, that somehow Israel was to blame for a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Israel was stopping aid from flowing on the ground into Gaza. And so first we saw a U.S. announcement of airdrops that were going to come in because supposedly there wasn't enough trucks that were going into Gaza, not enough border crossings open to deliver aid. And so the U.S. resorted to airdrops. And then that did not pacify sort of the Hamas supporters in the president's far left flank. And so he suddenly whipped out right before the State of the Union the idea of, well, we're going to build a port as well and deliver aid by sea. And just so everybody understands, there's no evidence that there is a lack of aid available for the people of Gaza. I think it's an important point to start off with all of this. There, in fact, is enough capacity for trucking aid into Gaza. There are enough border crossings open. There is enough stuff that we and other countries are paying for to deliver to the people of Gaza. And it's not a matter of whether you're delivering it by ground or air or sea. The question is whether or not aid is getting to the people who need aid by the hands of people who are not connected to Hamas. And it's not clear to anyone that whether you start delivering aid by sea, you're going to resolve that part of the challenge.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in terms of the kind of technical part of this of actually constructing this pier, what have we heard out of the administration? I know there were some press conferences out of the Department of Defense, but have we heard really any kind of specific answers about what this would look like?
Yeah, well, this has been turned over to the Joint Logistics Over the Shore Command, or JLOTS, that we've heard and seen in past situations, being able to quickly turn around on some sort of a construction project like this. You're seeing mass materials being built and ready for shipment in the port of Virginia, Newport News. That will be brought over by the Navy. We've heard reports of something like 250, 260 sailors involved in the mission. I think it's Naval Beach Group 1 that's in command of the mission. And the actual specifications that are at least in the press, and every time we hear somebody testify, it's very much, well, we don't have full details yet. Well, we can't really address that yet. You hear questions asked of the Pentagon spokesperson and say, well, that's still under discussion. One interesting data point we've seen is there would be a floating dock, essentially 72 by 270 feet, 3 miles potentially off of Gaza, with causeway ferries going back and forth with trucks to actually bring what is offloaded at that pier on shore. There have been other reports that there would be something that's actually connected to Gaza itself, which would be a different look for just actually setting this up and having U.S. forces that much closer to the shore and potentially at some point ferry the trucks back and forth. But if you take a look at this idea of that there would be some separation up to 3 miles of where we build a floating dock and then start ferrying things back and forth, there is going to have to be a U.S. military presence.
Right.
There may be a U.S. military presence that is involved in the ferrying. And we have seen a declaration that there will be no U.S. boots on the ground in Gaza. So whether that means U.S. forces will be limited to 3 miles away at a floating dock, or U.S. forces can come all the way to the actual pier at Gaza City or wherever they're going to set this up, that's not clear at this point. In either case, you're talking about still a need for force protection postures to be undertaken, a threat assessment, who's available, what sorts of threats exist out there. Could Hamas attack the actual ferrying operation onto shore? It's possible. We have seen in recent days a few rockets fired off again into Israel. The stockpile of rockets is not completely evaporated. Hamas has various tools at its disposal. Seems odd that they would want to trigger that sort of a direct confrontation with U.S. forces. I think that's a lower risk proposition, but not one that is not there. It's certainly still a possible risk. You also have regional threats to think about. Again, is this a high probability situation? Not sure. Leave that to intelligence officials and others. But we have seen drone warfare from Lebanon, from Syria, from Iraq. Drones that can travel pretty far distances. We've seen a drone from one of the Iranian militias in Syria go all the way down to Eilat at the southern end of Israel, traveling from Syria, mind you. So the idea that U.S. forces that are just off the coast of Gaza, there is going to be a risk there. How large that risk is, how you want to assess that risk, I think is a different question. So long as that is being integrated into the plan is what's going to be most important.
Absolutely. That there's no doubt about it. I mean, and because we've seen just even since October 7th, just around the entire Middle East. I mean, our troops are being constantly attacked from all sorts of proxy groups, funded by Iran, and so there's really no reason that we would think this would be different. And it sounds like you're saying the same thing. I mean, so given all the kind of concern with safety and all these, what happened in your opinion? Just kind of what would happen is when we get to the place where we are effectively trusting that Hamas, will not attack U.S. troops, even though they'll be basically sitting ducks right off the coast, well within range. I mean, I think there's been times in history we've seen where when you trust terrorist organizations not to attack, it usually ends up very poorly.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the fact that you would have this situation set up while Hamas is still present, without being able to guarantee who's going to be on the other side of that dock, who's going to be at the other side of the receiving end of the aid. I think that's a critical question that nobody can answer right now. And you're seeing this asked of the Pentagon. They can't answer that question. Is it going to be the UN? Is it going to be a hired contractor of some kind? Who's that contractor who's going to be there? Who's paying for that? Is it going to be the IDF? The IDF says no, and the Americans actually have ruled that out, that it will not be Israeli control of this area. So it does beg the question of, won't this area be penetrated by Hamas and its supporters? Will you be handing this over to UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, which we have seen proven to be a partner of Hamas in the distribution of aid and trying to help Hamas reassert control in northern Gaza? So what is our guarantee of excluding Hamas partners from being part of the receiving end, of being at the pier, at the dock, when aid's coming in, not just for the potential threat to U.S. forces, which we can't ignore, but also for the fundamental problem that I talked about at the very beginning, which is, if distribution is the challenge, not how aid is coming in or how much aid is coming in, what are you solving for here? Are you actually solving a problem here? Or are we paying for something and creating a risk that is actually going to help Hamas distribute aid among Hamas or by Hamas in a way that leverages their capabilities to reassert control while Israel is battling to extinguish all the flames of Hamas in northern Gaza still? The idea the administration has said to the Israelis, we don't want to see you go into Rafah. We want to see you focus on stabilization operations in the north, because Hamas, we're seeing a resurgence in the north. Well, how does this fit into that? Let's take that as on its face, that we should be concerned about Hamas resurgence in the north and reestablishing itself. Is this pier going to help Hamas reestablish itself or not? What is the non-Hamas distribution plan after you hit the pier? I think that's an important question that has not been answered.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I and there were some reports that came out that said that there might be some use of private military contractors, kind of using this. What is your take on that part of this?
I've seen that report. I've seen a couple of private contractors themselves that have them, sort of put out their own statements of, hey, we want to do this. We would do this. We'd be involved. Who's going to pay for that is a question. How is their security really going to be guaranteed is a question. I don't know if that's something that I personally would sign up to. It could solve for, the idea of IDF is not present, U.S. military is not present, and somebody's being willing to pay there and fight Hamas and take casualties in their private contracting force, and be part of a distribution network. Okay, if somebody's willing to take that risk, and they would actually maybe be willing to be hired on to patrol convoys and establish different safe distribution networks in northern Gaza, I guess that could be part of a plan if the Saudis want to pay for that and the UAE wants to pay for that. It does go to a fundamental question of sort of the day after Hamas, of who's policing these areas in the short term while you're setting up a new civil government. There has been discussion of having private security, private contractors be a part of that, whether the Egyptians contribute to that, the Saudis, UAE, others. Whether or not that's a good idea, I'm not so sure. I think in the end, there's going to have to be civilian populations that are taking responsibility for themselves. that there's going to need to be a vetting, which is, we know, taking place, of people who are not Hamas hardened supporters, fighters, who are willing to be part of a post-Hamas structure, who want to be part of the distribution of aid and delivery of services that can replace reliance on the United Nations, can replace reliance on Hamas or others. Are you denying that transition? Are you delaying that transition? Are you harming the population in some way by simply putting this on a private contractor security force instead of dealing with the real problem at hand, which is you got to destroy Hamas? You got to get rid of the Hamas enablers like UNRWA, and you have to build the actual civil society structure. I think there's a strong argument for that. But in the short term, if everybody wants to pay for private contracting to secure that area, I mean, I don't think the U.S. taxpayer should be on the hook for that. But if the Saudis want to pay for that and it would actually work and keep the aid out of the hands of Hamas, it might be a short-term solution.
Interesting. I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the UN Security Council resolution, the UN resolution calling for a ceasefire, and then kind of dropping in some language about freeing of the hostages, which the United States, of course, abstained from that vote. And that was kind of a break from what's happened before, where there's been a veto of that vote. So can you just talk a little bit about that and the import of this?
Yeah, listen, Security Council resolutions are important politically. And I mean that in the truest sense of political warfare, showing support for allies, putting pressure and condemnation on enemies. And the Russians and the Chinese understand that that's what the Security Council today is a venue for. They veto any resolution that they find is not in their interest to stop the U.S. from advancing its own interests. And they put forward and support resolutions that in some way undermine the United States or its allies as well. For some reason, this administration has not woken up to that being the state of play in the Security Council, and they still are living in a fantasy world of the post-Cold War dividend in 1990s, where we can just sit around the table in Turtle Bay and just hammer out a good compromise resolution to solve all the world's problems, and that we're not actually in sort of a Cold War 2.0 where we're battling Russia and China on a daily basis. And so on Friday, the Biden administration rolled into New York with a draft Security Council resolution that, by the way, was not entirely supportive of Israel. A lot of criticism of it that I would have. It opposed an Israeli operation in Rafah, which the Israelis are eventually going to have to do to clear out the last Hamas stronghold once they're done in Khan Yunis, and to be able to get hostages out and get to the leadership of Hamas, including Yahya Sinwar, the operational leader in Gaza. It tried to have it both ways on UNRWA, where U.S. supports an UNRWA investigation into claims that its employees were part of October 7th, but still values and holds UNRWA to be irreplaceable in Gaza. That's not bad policy. That's bad policy. The U.S. Congress just prohibited U.S. funding for another year to UNRWA. But it at least, checked a few boxes. It said October 7th happened and it was horrible, and it started all of this. It said Hamas is a terrorist organization and should be condemned. It said that any ceasefire should be connected to the release of hostages. Okay, all these things. And it also happened to condemn the Houthis for ongoing attacks in the Red Sea. Well, these were all bridges too far for China and Russia, close allies of Iran, and thereby close allies of Hamas and the Houthis, two proxies of Iran, because it named Hamas. It condemned Hamas. It named October 7th and condemned October 7th. It connected any ceasefire to the release of hostages. So it vetoed the resolution. Now, the resolution had support from our allies, and the Biden administration had an opportunity to take that out for a walk and say, look at what Hamas allies in the Security Council just did. Russia and China have shown us their true faces once again. Opportunity for political warfare to delegitimize Beijing, the CCP, and Vladimir Putin in Russia for standing with Hamas, standing with the Houthis in front of the entire world. And instead, they internalized a completely different message, that the U.S. is isolated, that the U.S. couldn't achieve its Security Council resolution, that its base supporters demanding the U.S. get Israel to back down didn't occur because it couldn't pass its resolution and claim it got a ceasefire resolution passed. And so over the weekend, by the way, all of this happening while Israel, the Qataris, the Egyptians, the US CIA director, and representatives from Hamas are in Doha, Qatar, negotiating over a potential temporary ceasefire and a hostage deal, with Hamas remaining firm in outrageous demands and a lot of pressure building on Israel to cave. The US got Israel to cave again, negotiate against itself, make more concessions in this negotiation, offer more Palestinian terrorists to be released from Israeli jails in exchange for every hostage released as part of a potential 6-week ceasefire, and then rolled back into Turtle Bay this morning on Monday and says, okay, there's a new resolution on the table, doesn't name Hamas, let alone condemn Hamas as a terrorist organization, doesn't mention October 7th at all, as if we just woke up, March 25th, 2024. Whoa, the IDF is in Gaza? Like, how did that happen? They're just there, and civilians are suffering, don't know why. All looks bad. And so the resolution takes all that out and says we demand a ceasefire, and we also demand that hostages get released. But the two of those things don't have to happen together. Total win for Hamas. Total win for Hamas. Guess who backs the resolution? Shockingly, Russia and China. Guess who has the power to veto that resolution? The United States, another permanent member of the Security Council. And while Russia and China had no problem vetoing our resolution on Friday, we don't want to be isolated at cocktail parties in New York or Geneva or elsewhere. So we abstained. We abstained. A major victory for Hamas, undermining Israel at the negotiating table today in Doha, Qatar. And the signal, if I'm Yahya Sinwar and I'm looking at this, you've got American pressure on Israel to stop any offensive into Rafah. Now you have an American acquiescence to a resolution that disconnects releasing of hostages from a ceasefire deal, doesn't even talk about Hamas or October 7th. The signals are all very clear. American pressure is coming and growing on Israel to stop the war before Hamas has been destroyed. If you're Sinwar, why do you need to give up anything? Why do you need to cave? What pressure are you feeling? You might survive at the hand of America. It's unbelievable. So very disappointed in the administration for not vetoing this resolution. And I think it reflects not just the policy shift that's been underway for a few weeks on Israel and its implications of foreign policy, but a real lack of understanding of what our international organization strategy should be, what the Security Council venue should be for the United States, and a major missed opportunity for political warfare against our two greatest state adversaries in China and Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned a little bit about Rafah, and that's there's been a lot of conversations about that, about Israel, needing to go on Rafah, but the Biden administration, Vice President Harris recently saying that, she's not ruling anything off the table, if, basically threatening Israel if they were to, to go on Rafah, and things seem to be escalating, especially now that as Netanyahu has canceled that delegation that was supposed to come to the United States. So what do you kind of see as the future? What are the next steps here? It seems like Israel is going to go into Rafah, and that seems like a necessary thing. How do you see the administration responding, and kind of how does this all play together moving forward?
Yeah, listen, I think you're going to see the IDF starting to release more and more information that really helps the American public and the world public understand what is Rafah? Why is Rafah important? Why is it necessary for the IDF to go into Rafah? Right now, this is some sort of abstract conversation of, well, you've destroyed Hamas in most of Gaza. Why don't you just consolidate your gains and work on smuggling, and let's, work on humanitarian aid in the meantime. You don't need to go into Rafah to win the war. That's sort of the supposition, the premise of the argument being put forward by the White House. You don't need to go into Rafah to win the war, to destroy Hamas. Is that true? Is that true, or is that not true? Is that a statement that is intended to cover up a policy of trying to drive to ceasefire as quickly as possible to appease a radical base? So to the extent that there is evidence of hostages being held in Rafah, something that was just referenced by the IDF spokesperson in a Monday press conference, that should be made public. To the extent that the tunnel networks that run between Khan Yunis and Rafah are active, and that you can't really get to them unless you're in Rafah and have squeezed both sides to lay siege essentially to where Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Deif, and perhaps many other leaders and hostages are hiding, that needs to be explained. To the extent that you need to secure the border between Egypt and Gaza to prevent tunneling, to prevent smuggling, to prevent an escape by leaders or bringing hostages out or getting weapons back in, that needs to be explained. And also, you need to explain what the future looks like if Hamas remains in charge of Rafah and there's a permanent ceasefire, and you have not dismantled the tunnel network, you have not dismantled the battalions, and Hamas can consolidate and start planning its resurgence from the south. How much time would that look like? What would that look like, et cetera? These are all factors in why the IDF knows in the end it will have to go in. Now, is there a potential sequencing that allows a certain amount of time to save face with the United States if that's really all that the Biden administration wants? If the White House in private says, we understand you're going to go into Rafah, but we need time for this or that, is there sequencing that can take place to have an agreement? Yes, that could happen. Again, like we talked about, should Israel ignore the resurgence of Hamas in the north? Is there a need for stabilization operations in the north, the way that Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, talked about last week? Yes, there is. I think that that should be a concern. There needs to be a strategy to ensure that you don't take your eye off the ball of what Hamas is doing in the north while just focusing on the south. Is there a need to focus on taking the border of Rafah between Egypt and Gaza and securing that border? Might that potentially be a precursor step to a larger operation into Rafah? Yes, that might logically make sense just from a military planning perspective. Cut off the escape routes, cut off the smuggling routes, control the border before you are going to take the rest of the area. Is there also a need to ensure you have an aid distribution plan that bypasses where you're going to be waging the war in Rafah to ensure you don't cut off the flow of humanitarian goods, which obviously a lot of it coming up through that border of the south, and you don't actually now take the blame. Obviously, the propaganda says Israel's to blame for humanitarian crisis, but if you start cutting off by your own warfare the actual routes in, then that would fulfill that propaganda. So all of these things need to be figured out by the Israelis, in my view, with serious planning, and some of that can have support from the Biden administration to fulfill. But if this is all just a game by the White House to get Israel into a permanent ceasefire without ever taking out Hamas in Rafah, without ever clearing the tunnel infrastructure, that is not something that I think Israel can ever stand for, nor should it. And supporters of Israel in the Congress who understand the strategic need for Israel to destroy Hamas, to project strength to Hezbollah in the north, to project strength to Iran in Tehran over the range of its proxy threats and its nuclear program cannot be understated. And so, to the extent congressional leaders right now speak out and push back, whether it's the Security Council resolution, the calls not to go into Rafah, the IDF needs to have our support to do what it deems is strategically necessary to reestablish Israel's security in the region. Otherwise, there will not be an Israel for the next 75 years, as there was for the last 75 years. And that's a detriment to our national security.
Right. Right. Our only ally in the Middle East. And that's exactly right. And I think about our strongest ally, rather, in the Middle East. And I think about, you mentioned Congress. Senator Schumer recently said that he's calling for new elections, against Netanyahu, and we've also seen, but on the other hand, one kind of positive thing was with this minibus that went through. We saw the latest funding bill that it did include funding for Israel. Do you think that is sufficient for the time being? What is your opinion on that? And then also on the other side, some of these calls against the current government in Israel.
Yeah, listen, what Senator Schumer said was completely out of line. I think a lot of members of Congress have spoken out to that effect quite correctly. The president obviously said he liked Senator Schumer's speech, but quite ironic for a party that has been howling about the decay of democracy and foreign governments interfering in our democracy to try to interfere and meddle in one of our closest allies' democracy is quite hypocritical. And in fact, while Israel is in a war, the IDF on the battlefield, at the negotiating table to try to get hostages out, hostages, which, by the way, include American
Right.
citizens, to try to destabilize the government, to force new elections, to send Israel into chaos, is outrageous. If the Israeli people pressure Netanyahu into a new election, that is their prerogative. It's their country. It's their democracy. That's not our role in the United States. Our role is to understand, is democracy alive in Israel? Yes. Is it flourishing in Israel? Yes. Does it have a free press? Yes. Is there freedom of assembly? Yes. Does it have checks and balances? Yes. Is the IDF a military that holds itself to high ethical standards and investigates itself of wrongdoing, just like our military? Yes. Okay, well, we've checked the box on everything we need to know that Israel is a strong ally, a democratic ally. And we have to then evaluate all the strategic interests that we have of Israel being strong and winning this war against terrorism.
Right.
Check, check. What are we doing trying to bring down who we don't like for what political reasons in the Israeli government? Don't we have enough of our own politics to worry about, of having to be involved in Israeli politics, which is, I mean, our politics is nothing compared to their
That's right.
politics if you ever watch a Knesset session. So in the end, very inappropriate, obviously hyper political, whether that's to pacify folks like Senator Chris Van Hollen, who have become real, just horrific opponents of the state of Israel, that wing of the Democratic Party that Senator Schumer might be worried about. Maybe there's been rumor of taking the leadership role away from him as Senate leader. If he didn't make a call like this, he's trying to hide behind criticism of Netanyahu rather than fully abandoning Israel entirely, based on criticism he's receiving. I don't know, but I also don't really care because it was inappropriate, and he should have the moral fortitude and the courage to stand for what's right, regardless of this pressure from a radical left wing. With respect to the supplemental request that's still pending and the FY 24 money that has just passed, it's not a good practice to try to get Israel to have to dip into funds that are being provided for long-term strategic needs. Think about long-term procurement of F-35s, of F-15s, of attack helicopter squadrons, of refueling tankers, whatever it is. These are things that Israel needs to finance, and that is the main purpose of our robust foreign military financing that we provide to Israel on an annual basis is $3.3 billion. That is not a replacement for emergency critical support for munitions replenishment, operations costs, various things that Israel needs today in a multi-front enduring conflict. And remember, we're just focused right now on Gaza. There is a much larger potential conflict in Lebanon to come at some point. They're already in a war with Hezbollah on a daily basis. If Gaza wasn't going on and October 7th had never happened, we would consider Israel and Hezbollah at war. Instead, we've now normalized the idea of dozens of rockets and missiles and drones coming into northern Israel on a daily basis as just, another day in northern Israel rather than a full-scale war. And of course, the idea of a full-scale war between Hezbollah and Israel is dramatically more severe than anything we have seen in Gaza, because the capabilities, the threat from Hezbollah is 10 times that Hamas ever had. Talking about 200,000 rockets and missiles and drones and other threats. And so you combine the ongoing needs in Gaza, the ongoing threat from Lebanon, the threat Israel's facing from Yemen with the Houthis firing missiles all the way to Eilat, drone warfare and other warfare coming from Syria or Iraq that can reach into Israel, into all parts of Israel, as we've seen, and the clock on Iran's nuclear program, the need for Israel to do all of these things and still finance the long-term capabilities it needs to potentially defeat that threat from Iran, not for its own security, but for our security and the rest of the world's security. These are critical. And so the faster we can get, however we can break the impasse and get Israel the emergency assistance it needs, the better. Will there be a Band-Aid potentially from what has just passed? Yes. This cannot backfill, this cannot replace the emergency assistance that Israel needs.
Absolutely. Well, Thank you so much, Rich, for just sharing all this with us and your expertise. And we just appreciate all that you are doing just in this space to shine a light on just how just how absurd some of the what we're hearing from some parts of our country about basically blaming Israel for what's happened. And it is frustrating for many of us. And I thank people like you who are on the front lines talking about it. And for all of you watching at home, thank you for joining us. Please stay up to date with our different events. You can go to hudson.org and see what all the events that we have upcoming. So thank you and have a good one.